Hi, everybody. Hey, what's this? Where are we going? What are we looking at? Oh, of course. It's Krakdhumvror, an icy dwarven prison in the furthest end of the Serpent Spine, also known as the Giant's Anvil. Due to their isolation, the Quartz dwarves developed a society differently than the rest of the dwarven holds. And even if their prison colony was spared the brunt of the orcish green tide, their harsh immediate environment stunted their potential for growth. Dangerous hordes of giant kin and other monsters roam the surrounding caves and the northern pass, while a new threat is posed by rapid expansion of grey orcs in the west and of war-crazed centaurs in the east. Just like Sigdir and other surviving holds, Krakdhumvror closed the gates and waited. So as soon as November 1444 is over, the Remnant Stagnation Disaster fires. Resolving the Remnant Stagnation is necessary to obtain the first colonist and break out of the icy prison. This implies helping three factions with preparation for progress: the Reclaimers, who share a vision of a great capital, the Expansionists, who advocate for a massive colonization effort, and the Guard, who stand for military might, combat prowess, and tactical superiority against the immediate foes. Against these initiatives stand the Beholden, a group of older dwarves who fear the dangers ahead and hate any change. Now, this disaster presents some interesting choices between outfitting one faction quickly and ending the disaster, or investing in preparing more than one faction for the extra secondary benefits that they bring. But a special kind of cheese can be added to the meal. Not sure if this is actual cheese or just clever use of mechanics, but it does smell of Gouda a little bit. During the disaster, while different progressive factions are developing plans to end the stagnation, the eagerness to fight of the Beholden increases to a breaking point. This triggers the Reactionaries event, which forces you to choose between cutting down on progress, suffering a random and very unpleasant global debuff, or purge the Beholden, spawning a large number of noble rebels while hurting stability. The event most important for the cheese omelette is the clan's patronage event. This allows you to take a large funding offer from a dwarven clan to greatly increase the readiness of a faction, in exchange for a high chance to spawn a round of Beholden noble rebels. Typically, these rebels have a high chance to break your meager remnant army, siege the whole down, and ruin your manpower, capital, and game. Yet the easy way to deal with these is to simply accept their demands as soon as they spawn. Normally this would be a bad thing, but for a single province dwarven hold, it's really inconsequential. Accepting noble demands hurts local autonomy, prestige, and gives nobility 10% of crown land. None of these is a problem when you only control one province and no crown land. On top of it all, your warriors can keep drilling and gaining that sweet army professionalism. And you should get rid of all crown land as soon as possible, while giving the nobles zero privileges. This is especially important for Krakdhumvror, who require that the nobles have no privileges in order to progress their mission tree later. Having zero crown land does not matter at this stage. The only real penalty is 20% less tax income, yet most income comes from production, so this malus is largely irrelevant. No autonomy penalty affects the capital, so it's all good, while the extra power points given by the mana privileges and the gold resulted from selling crown land is so much more valuable. Prestige can stay at -100 as well. Sure, it affects trade and diplomacy, both internal and external, but who cares? There's nobody in the Giant's Anvil anyway, and prestige increases very fast from 100 to 0, so just don't worry about it. Accepting noble demands time and again will speed up preparations and have no real consequence, so you can end the disaster with all three factions fully prepared in less than 10 years, even faster if you choose to only prepare one faction. As a cherry on top, you also get 3 stability points at the end. My favorite main faction is the Expansionists. Even if I don't run 2 colonists at once, due to massive manpower costs of guarding them from goblin and orcish natives, the massive settler increase and free tax income are more than welcome. With Krakdhumvror, getting out of the Giant's Anvil as fast as possible is of paramount importance. All in all, with stagnation over, our frosty adventure can truly begin. If all is well and stars align, one should be ready to finish the first 2 missions before November 1454. That is when the first election occurs in the clan council. Councillor Garlim Frozenforge was a great leader, but the 5 clans that ruled the Quartz Hold insisted on changing leadership. The stagnant Remnant Disaster did not impede expanding infrastructure and deepening the capital, pushing it towards 50 development. This grand restoration reignited interest in the ancient fortress in the center of the oldest district, Midjurdr-Kralt, upon whose foundations the hold of Krakdhumvror was built. Its walls, firm but unused, were way past due for refurbishment. Starting as a prison of the old Al-Dwarov, the council decided to finally tear the old girl down and make way for a better future. Krakdhumvror is an ancient hold founded by the exiles and criminals of the Dwarven Empire. It has stood alone for centuries against many enemies, fighting near constantly to keep those who would destroy them at bay. The state of perpetual war gave rise to a unique culture amongst the Dwarven holds, where sacrifice and skill were valued above bloodline, and the good of the hold was held above that of the Empire. The outcasts of the Empire gave more for the survival of their hold than any other dwarf, be that by gold or blood. This attitude became known as the chain bond amongst the people of Krakdhumvror, a chain between each member of the hold from generation to generation, forged in the frozen hardship of the north. Not having given any privileges to the strong nobility and having employed a band of novice shield war mercenaries allowed the chance to weaken the nobility before the first election. The 5 oldest clans have long been solidifying their power over the meritocratic council for generations. They have all but ensured that their members were identified as the brightest and best, so that when elections would come, it would always be merely a choice between some combination of the 5. Getting a grip over the government was necessary to effect real change. The land taken from the nobility, paired with a land seize, would allow subsequent adoption of the military PowerPoint privilege, but the perceived act of tyranny sparked a small rebellion that intended to make the state see reason through devastation. The rebels were wrong to think they would succeed. In the same time, colonists were ready and eager to explore and exploit the caves. The council decided that the Quartz dwarves could use extra living space, so they decided to push into the tunnels to the southwest, towards the surface, and establish a link to the outside world for new resources and information. The shield wall guard could only support 1 colony at a time for now, so the northeastern caves would have to wait. The wise approach for the dead-end tunnel area was to wait for the Age of Greentide ability that granted extra development upon colonization. Simur of Clan Shalebeard would become councillor in 1455. He granted a spree of privileges to the estates to aid the colonization efforts further and worked to improve their loyalty. His predecessor was heavy-handed in quelling the clan's hold on things, but he could not keep noble lands in good faith and was planning to redistribute them amongst the other estates, spreading the power of the state and keeping the heat from their retribution off the council. Redistributing the land would also remove the initial permanent debuff, stubborn clans, which seriously hampered monthly government reform progress. The Tier 1 government itself was locked and could not become a dictatorship. It offered some advisor cost reduction and a lot of influence to the nobility estate, to the detriment of the merchants and of the yearly republican tradition increase. A random earthquake in the capital cracked the earth in 1455. It was colloquially known as Serpent Smite, which ruined the iron exploitation in the province. This was not so bad, as the iron production ended up being replaced with a booming paper industry. This might have ramification for the future of the Hold and its missions, but that would remain to be seen. Skill over blood, or Zaru Ubr Bloth, has long been something of an unofficial motto of the Krakdhumvroric administration. As it was founded by exiles and criminals, Krakdhumvror had very few strong clans in its early days. Instead of positions being determined by bloodlines or clans, Krakdhumvror favored those with individual talent, which has resulted in a far less rigid hierarchy than most other holds. Even those of the most humble upbringings could rise up to the top, and nepotism was all but sacrilegious in the frozen halls of power. Because of this, Krakdhumvror had enjoyed an innovative and flexible administration for much of its existence. Many a time, a disgraced scion of a royal clan fled to Krakdhumvror, demanding status and position based on little more than their parentage, and all were told the same thing: Zaru über Bloth, skill over blood. With the expansionists' help, the end of the tunnel was reached, and at the province of Hardy Hole, the Quartz dwarves enjoyed their first whiff of fresh air for many generations. Guards were set up at the mountain entrance, and expeditions set out onto the surface to gather as much information about the surrounding lands as possible. The first city outside the mountain, Broken Wheel, became a base for further expeditions into the northern pass, and even into the wilderness in the east. The surface hold of Dur-Vajatun sat directly across the valley from the giant's anvil. It was the last stop for those sent or coming to the Quartz hold. The old observatories and laboratories there still remained somewhat intact. It seemed as though it was too far east for any orcs or goblins to bother settling in its ruins, and that spared the hold from any real infestation. Reclaiming Dur-Vajatun would ignite a colonizing rush to race across the Serpent's Veil and towards the old capital of Almdir. Yet factions argued between pushing south and needing to focus on the northern pass to the west. The council could not effectively satisfy everyone, as no compromise seemed acceptable. Krakdhumvror was torn between these two unbudging forces, so the colonial rush bonus was almost instantly lost. The dead-end tunnel to the north was named such because there was no way to dig further after it. Initially abandoned, the caves in the region were thought to contain nothing of value. Colonizing them with extra development allowed prospectors to challenge these beliefs. Great wealth could have hid in there, which more modern methods of extraction could recover, so an effort to prospect for ore was initiated. The dire discovery was that there were orcs on the far side of the lonely mountain, expanding rapidly into the east. These strange grey orcs were not to be allowed into the pass, lest they would repeat the deeds of their ancestors and threaten all that Krakdhumvror had accomplished. With a grudge reignited, the dwarves were ready to fight their first real foe. With Frozen Maw busy throwing themselves against the forts of Urviksten, there was no better time for a preemptive strike. Between Frozen Maw and the Centaurs, this is always the critical point in Krakdhumvror campaigns. This is where the game is made or ruined. Attacking as early as possible is always the best way to ensure survival. With the Grey Orcs distracted and with only a couple of cannons to topple the defenses and open the opportunity for assault of the Balvroren citadel, Frozen Maw was beaten before they realized what happened to them. Not to say that Krakdhumvror's warriors were weak. They have always been known as hardy warriors throughout the Dwarovar. With a fresh start on the surface and new challenges, their pool of military officers were also encouraged to bring out more competent ones from amongst the soldiers, before their chance to prove themselves in battle ended with them dead. A system of rigorous trials of physical endurance, martial skill, and intelligent tactics was devised. A facility was set up in the freezing cold of the northern valley of Kvaldvegr, where any willing man, woman, peasant, or king would be allowed to take the trials of the Rite of Cold Iron and ascend the military ranks. In the east, the Black Herd centaurs were trampling the neighboring ogres under hoof, but were not yet united under the banner of the Great Cain. So dwarven colonists took the opportunity to expand as far east as possible and claim as much land in Ilmoitza as they could. Even with the full support of the expansionists, Krakdhumvror was spreading a bit too thin, and the burden of colonization began to be felt, as the infested halls of Almdir cried for liberation from the squatting black orcs. Krakdhumvror had a reputation of being highly utilitarian in style when compared to the grand marvels of the rest of Dwarovar, and while the halls of the Frozen Hold were not without their grand vistas that could rival those from other holds, this reputation was not entirely unwarranted. Krakdhumvror's particular style of architecture, known as Orvzana or Cold Stone, existed only within the realms of the Quartz dwarves, and had little pomp and circumstance. This was not without purpose. Due to its origin and an expanded fort, every building in Krakdhumvror was first and foremost dedicated to defense and survival. Even the smallest hovels were built to serve as fortresses unto themselves. More than once, these fortifications stalled invading monsters long enough to save Krakdhumvror from the destruction that befell all other holds in the West Serpent Spine, leading to a common Quartz dwarf saying, "Those in gold houses often end up dead." The prospecting for ore opened up great opportunities for exploitation of iron and gems in the dead-end mines. This new source of iron was crucial to future ice-steel smithing operations and turned the local provinces into bustling cities, mitigating the penalty costs of developing cave terrain in the area. In the south, a cruel war was declared against the newly resettled Orlazam-Azdir, and through their subjugation, the control of the flooded Serpent's Vale, the infested ruins of Aldir, and the hold of Mithradum could be secured with minimal costs. Expansionist fervor led the Quartz hold to humiliate and conquer to the east and west, subjugating the platinum hold of Haraz Oldum and beating the centaurs of Black Herd in a race to humiliate them before their inevitable fall to the newly forged Great Khanate in the Forbidden Plains. The Dagrite dwarves to the south recaptured the hold of Ernatvir and were rebuilding the Dwarven Railway, but made a grave mistake. They did not fully remove the Rail Skulker Goblin clan from the map, and Krakdhumvror summarily subjugated the Goblin clan and used them as an engine of reconquest to push towards the Serpent's Reach. A fun incursion to distract the population from the horrors of the Horde curse that inevitably plagued the increasingly prosperous Quartz realm. Krakdhumvror was well known for its unusual type of magic, icecraft. More akin to Canorian schools of magic than the runic magic dwarves usually practice, this unique type of cryomancy defied proper classification to any known branch. The exact details of icecraft were a closely guarded secret, but it was known that the hold's namesake frozen forges channeled the biting cold of the northern winds into a magical energy that allowed the hold's ice smiths to create ice steel, a versatile metal imbued with the characteristics of ice and freezing water. From weapons that gave enemies frostbite and arrows that shattered into shrapnel on impact, to armor that could unfreeze and flow back together, the potential applications of ice steel were widespread. While the production of the whole signature steel had over the centuries declined, ice steel armaments were nonetheless common enough that well-off soldiers would have at least one weapon or piece of armor made of it, making the Frozen Forge Hall's armies a glacial wall of unbending steel and death. The Ice Smith's estate uniquely replaced the standard mages. I personally find this estate a bit of a detriment. They lose the ability to cast typical spells and instead have access to 5 unique ice smithing techniques, which are unlocked in time via the mission tree. These techniques' effects also increase in power through various missions or through granting the supply more iron privilege, which comes with a drawback of severely hampering iron production in all provinces, with the exception of Krakdhumvror itself. Their loyalty bonuses also include an Imperial Authority growth modifier, which is completely useless for the Quartz dwarves and seems to be an oversight. Casting each spell incurs a significant power point cost and a large cash cost as well. The cash costs can be removed with instances of discounts that can also be obtained through missions. These discounts are limited in number, so they need to be used very intentionally. Most spell effects last for 10 years, just like the standard ones, but casting is not prevented during this time, so multiple spells can be cast at the same time. Some that are recast ahead of time will waste precious resources if not paying attention. The 5 spells in order of appearance are the following. Ice Steel Equipment is the first and costs military mana to nobody's surprise. It grants military benefits to the army. Initially only shock damage dealt and received improvements, but eventually adding fire damage dealt and received as well. The drawback is that the reinforcement cost while the spell is active will be doubled at the highest level. This spell is always useful when facing a dangerous opponent, where any combat bonus counts. The second is Ice Steel Drills, which lowers development cost and increases production efficiency, but only in provinces with minerable resources like copper, iron, and mithril. I didn't do the math, but I doubt that the production efficiency increase in some provinces refunds the cash cost. So this is really useful only when applying mission discounts. This is made even worse if the supply more iron privilege is active, because it actively hurts iron production so much. I'm not sure when to use this one, if ever. Number 3 is frozen gems. This increases the local trade value of gems, and this spell, if I may use a superlative, is pointless in my opinion. Unless you are willing to spend a year's worth of income and 150 diplomatic mana for a plus 1.5 yearly prestige bonus. Ice Fields is a defensive spell that can create a large intense blizzard in an entire region. This blizzard will increase attrition for enemies by 2 and decrease hostile movement speed by 20%. This one only costs money, but it requires a setup for each of the regions. The only targetable regions are the Northern Pass and the different sections of the Serpent Spine. For a region to be affected by the ice fields, it requires a certain number of mage towers to be constructed locally. This spell also suffers from a cost that is way too prohibitive, both in resources and opportunity, to ever be considered for casting, while being far inferior to the standard warding spells. Arguably, the only useful spell in the arsenal of the Ice Smiths is the Ice Steel Hold. This spell is a useful administrative mana dump, which lowers construction time, minimum autonomy and province governing cost in a hold province of your choice. Supplying more iron will decrease the administrative mana cost, and the drawback is a 50% higher local construction cost. As a neat side effect, the holds will maintain prosperity bonuses even if the states that they inhabit lose them to devastation. This spell is the only one that I really found worth casting, but it is unlocked quite late in the campaign and it is in some ways less impactful than the standard aiding construction spell. Finally, the Ice Smiths receive a unique privilege very late in the mission tree for +1 Diplo Rep and +1 Monthly Splendor. Hooray! Overall, this estate is quite puzzling, and it makes me think that I'm missing something important related to it. Through the existence of the Ice Smiths, I find that Krakdhumvror is the slowest dwarven nation in terms of construction, which kinda falls in line with their frosty theme. From humble beginnings, in the span of a few decades, a hole that was stagnant for centuries, buried deep into the most isolated frozen rock of Halan, Krakdhumvror's influence was spread from the giant's grave to the northern sea, and as south as Mithradum and Ernatvir, across the ancient capital of Almdir. This abrupt expansion was destined to spark fear and discontent. Compounded by the shock of the recent disaster of the Horde Curse, the internal strife culminated in a civil war that they called Borduz-az-Stun, the Battle of Stone. Dwarf against dwarf, hold against hold. The people were spread thin, ill-supplied, and disunified by the constant change in government focus from one project to the next without finishing them or seeing them through. The citizens were rising up in the streets of the holds and the farms on the surface, mines and markets full of shouting voices and violence. On top of it all, the 5 major clans were grumbling and moving behind everything. It looked like there was no end to the chaos, and that with one wrong move, everything that the Quartz dwarves accomplished would be buried in an instant. The council could not stop the wave of unrest and the severe lack of stability and income. Colonizing efforts in the few leftover provinces of the Northern Pass became futile. It was time to wait and react to the needs and excesses of the people and the clans. The future of the government was in a cruel balance. The council had to decide whether it was preferred to centralize power in a monarchical rulership or to build the foundations of a great new dwarven republic. With no manpower left after a number of costly wars in the western Serpent Spine, the struggle would have proved to be a very dangerous one. At the first sign of peasant revolt, the choice was made to steer towards monarchy. Clan Iceheart was well known as having the finest military minds in the nation. They held positions in most upper echelons of the military and have come with a deal. If the council intended to centralize power, they opted in and offered massive manpower recovery support. In turn, they demanded to be first to pick military positions in the army. That would mean that most of the military hierarchies would contain Ice Heart officers, giving them great sway in future military endeavors and a boost in state corruption. Refusing the deal would mean having to fight an army of noble rebels so large that it would be almost impossible to stop. There was no choice. The nation needed Clan Ice Heart. The merchants were next to petition for reforming the nation into a republic in exchange for their support. Unfortunately, the council made up its mind to push towards monarchy, so the merchants were refused and they rose up in arms. They were swiftly silenced by the Ice Heart troops and mercenaries. Clan Earthstriker had been in control of the mining operations in Krakdhumvror for generations. They had great stake in the dead-end mines as well. They approached Third with a proposal wherein they offered assistance in funding the reformation of the Republic in exchange for higher sale prices on their raw materials. The choice was given between directing funds and workshops elsewhere into the mines to pay for their extra costs, or putting them down for obtaining control of the mines directly. The Earth Strikers were refused special treatment, and they sadly chose in turn to respond with violence. Next was Clan Trollslayer. They have always been the finest and mightiest warriors in Krakdhumvror. They earned their name many times over in battle, and now they approached the council with an offer as well. If power was to be consolidated, they were willing to help for a small increase in their usual salary. If not, they would find someone else who better suited their goals. Needing all military support that they could get, the council decided that some extra bodyguards would be welcome, and the troll slayers were paid their requested price. The general population wanted nothing but security for their rights, themselves, and their livelihoods. With a bit of effort, they could be calmed with a system of laws that would maintain their freedoms and get things under control for them. Promises would also do in these times of crisis to ease their minds that the state would work hard to improve their lives once the realm would stabilize. The fourth clan approached the negotiating table. Clan Shalebeard always produced many fine administrators and governors. They offered to aid in reforming the Republic into something great. Their request was to have their duties remain more or less as they were, but at a severe cost to future improvements of the administration and government as a whole. Their stubbornness to cooperate was to be their downfall, and they were slaughtered in the halls of the great Quartz hold. The Ice Smiths were the magically empowered class of the nation, wielding their ice magic with great skill for millennia. Their offer of alliance conditioned higher research funding in case of a consolidated approach to power. Refusing their immediate requests and making them wait for money like everyone else meant terrible potential devastation in the giant's anvil that the Ice Smiths called home. The little funds available to the state had to be used to buy their loyalty and keep them content. Clan Frozenforge had always had Krakdhumvror's greatest interest at heart. They had stood loyally by the chosen leaders of the Quartz folk through thick and thin. It was during the rule of Garlin Frozenforge that many attributed the start of the nation's great expansion, and the clan was quick to remind everyone of their historical leaders. Whichever path the council would choose in the struggle, the Frozenforge would stand by them. Their only request was that everything was to be done for the betterment of the hold. Gundomar, son of Garlim, was a fine choice as a leader, and he would stand by the side of the dwarven state no matter the cost. Clan Frozenforge offered a sliver of hope that the Battle of Stone was soon to be over. Krakdhumvror's meritocratic administration has long been a source of pride for the nation, as unlike in other holds, it rewarded talent and ensured that the hold's governing officials were of higher quality than everywhere else in the Dwarovar. Combined with the hold's will to embrace and adapt to changing circumstances, Krakdhumvror's administration was exceptionally well placed to deal with situations that would strain the administration of other nations. Indeed, with the factions and clans dealt with, and with all rebels crushed, administration could run again as usual. The battle had finally ended after 9 years of civil war. Power in the larger realm was consolidated around Gundomar Frozenforge, the new king of Krakdhumvror, and the new monarchy was ready to ride forth into a new world that waited to be carved by the icy winds of the north. Concluding the internal conflict revealed the true scope of Krakdhumvror's ambitions and mission tree. After a series of disasters, the world would be made to bear witness to the rise of a people once scoffed for being a forgotten prison colony. A prison colony that survived through force of will began carving an empire through force of arms. The modern hold of Krakdhumvror had its roots in Verkal Midjurdr-Kraut, fortress of the world's end. Originally built to protect Dwarovar against the ice giants of yore and manned by exiles and criminals banished from the rest of the Dwarovar, it became a derelict outpost after the giant civilization fell thousands of years ago and was eventually expanded into a hold. As the last outpost of the Owl Dwarov, isolated in the Giant's Anvil Mountains and disconnected from the Dwarov network, the only people who arrived to make a new life for themselves in the hold were those unwanted elsewhere in Dwarovar, or those trying to escape their past. This led to the outpost developing a reputation for a solitary culture and having very little interactions with the outside world, at least until the emergence of the orcs. As the holds of Western Serpent Spine fell, refugees began to pour to the hold from Andir, Orlazam-Azdir, and Durvajatun, desperate for safety from the orcish menace. The rapid expansion of the hold's population forced the dwarves to work with what little resources they had to expand the hold's defenses, living quarters, and infrastructure to accommodate a vastly larger population in a relatively short period of time. While this event took place ages ago, the dwarves of the frozen hold of Krakdhumvror still retained the lessons of those days to this day. While the event took place ages ago, the dwarves of the frozen hold of Krakdhumvror still retained the lessons of those days, allowing them to easily integrate foreigners and expand the hold's infrastructure to account for the needs of the people. Out of this fortified hold, cannons and warriors clad in ice steel were spilling into the Serpent Spine, Gerudia, and Descan. Cold and calculated conquests, they were necessary to ensure the security of the nation, so that the downfall of the Cronium throne would not repeat in the Quartz Empire. Fully consolidated in the northern pass and Gerudia, it became apparent that nobody in the history of Halan ever attempted or thought about exploring the wastes further north of what was for millennia the northernmost point of the Dwarven realms. Rumors of giants, monsters, and ancient evil magics have scared away people, dwarf or otherwise, away from the frozen desert, but no more. Clearly, there have been no giants for hundreds of years, so the king, with the support of the ice smiths, decided to work on setting up a base and a supply route in the province of Fulstun, where explorers could plan the first known expeditions into the icy unknown. Besides, where other civilized races would suffer hypothermia, the Krakdhumvrori dwarves were in their element. Their beloved northern pass would be crisscrossed by blizzards, both natural and magical in nature, but also by the Northernmost, a network of roads and the surface railroad that would connect the Anvil's entrance with the larger Serpent Spine from Durvajatun to Kukdir. In the center of this network, the Stram Anunstunad, formerly known as Lonely Mountain, was exploited by the ice smiths to provide with ample supplies of iron and copper. The first great expedition commenced, eager to discover what happened to the giants and their treasures, and uncover any other strange mysteries that lied in wait. They discovered an incredibly hostile land with aggressive mammoth herds and brutal blizzards. The first expedition returned with no real bounty, nor with all the members of the company alive, but with a lot of experience and lessons learned, eager to resupply, retool, and try again in the future. Steel and knowledge from Krakdhumvror and Durvajatun holds encouraged experimentation and research into more advanced ice forging techniques. Ram steel hammering techniques of Orlazam-Azdir were adapted, and immense blocks of ice would be used to improve the steel armor and weaponry of the warriors. With production ramping up every year, eventually whole structures could be built using the cold metal, leading to whole cities being encased in ice steel. Mithril was eventually added to the mix through exploitation of the sophisticated forges of Mithrathum, and eventually ice mithril production was also developed. The jewel crafting techniques of the platinum masters of Harazor Uldum were adapted too. Kings and emperors alike would scramble for a chance to commission ice gems for their crowns and sword hilts. A second great expedition departed for the frozen wastes, this time better prepared for the severe weather and wildlife. They penetrated further north, and the ice smiths even found some remnants of giant bones in several places. Even if the adventure took its toll on the company's manpower, their return was slightly more lucrative than the first. This time they brought back some interesting trinkets that made it worth the effort and ignited hope for an even more successful trip in the future. Conquering the western serpent spine down to the edge of the Segbandal prompted a large fortification effort where all the connections to the surface world had to be sealed with forts. Jorkad itself was turned from a crumbling ruin into an impenetrable bastion that proudly displayed its quartz banners over the Jorkad Lake. While the southern borders were clad in ice steel, the northern pass saw the erection of enchanted ice pylons where the ice smiths would congregate. At these structures, they would harness the cold and moisture from the air and create storm clouds anchored to the tip of the towers into a web of permanent blizzards to ward off anyone not as hardy as the quartz dwarves or arctic animals. In doing so, they virtually locked any Askani humans from encroaching, but also received a strange magical feedback from far north. The ice warding spell reacted with something hidden in the frozen wastes, and a third great expedition was put together to find out what this was. This time they would be guarded by an elite force of highly trained soldiers equipped head to toe in ice steel. The Grim Legion was the best dwarven fighting force that the North has ever seen, and with them at the vanguard of the expedition, the company was certain to succeed in finding the strange source of emanating magic. Eventually they did discover ruins of immense scale buried deep in the snow. They contained many interesting artifacts, too large to transport back, but they were counted and documented with drawings and sculptures. The adventurers made off with whatever could not be packed and carried. The stones themselves seemed to be what was creating the disturbance, reacting to Ice Smith's magic even while the expedition was present at the site. These ruins could only have been made by the dwarves' ancient enemies, the Ice Giants. Perhaps it was only one of several similar places to be found in those desolate wastes. The adventurers returned with cartfuls of huge artifacts to the praise and adulation of their compatriots. No other significant discovery was made, but the splendor of the success of the expedition rang through the empire. More things were certainly still laying hidden beneath the ice, but this would be the last such endeavor sponsored by the state. The ice smiths had an idea to recreate the entire site in immaculate detail using ice magic sculptures. They created full-size dioramas of the site and all of its artifacts so that any who wished to experience the past could do so. Giant's Anvil was one of the least hospitable environments in all Halan to found an urban society in. The region was undeveloped and isolated from the rest of the world, lacking in resources and surrounded by hostile monsters. And yet the Quartz dwarves have not only learned to survive in this hostile north, but thrive in it. It took the most tenacious and determined people to work together in order to survive in an unforgiving environment as Giant's Anvil. And centuries of hardships and struggle for survival have led to the dwarves of Krakdhumvror becoming as unyielding as the quartz they get their name from. No matter what they might be up against, the Quartz dwarves would face the odds with grizzled determination. In the less Arctic reaches of the Empire of Krakdhumvror, Escan and the deep woods were slowly taken over by the dwarven snowstorm. The Serpent's Reach Mountains were a branch of the Serpent Spine, which projects went as far back as Old Ostanor. Its holds have produced many wonders in their time, from the Great Warding Gate of the Flint Dwarves to the glittering diamonds of Arg Urstun. With Arg Tunad under Krakdhumvrori control, it was time to push into the Reach. Dwarves in general were never known to be the warmest of races, and no dwarves less so than the Quartz ones of the Giant's Anvil. But there was once a hold which was known for its romantic setting and free love for all who visited. Ovdal Lodhum unfortunately declined from what it once was with its tunnels of love and its romantic glowstone traditions. With the garnet hold secured and rebuilt, the brothels could be reopened and romance attractions could start thawing the hearts of the Quartz dwarves for a permanent decrease in national unrest, so valuable for aggressive conquests. Even if the deep woods were firmly under control, the Fae present there were fickle tricksters who preyed on the unwary and poisoned their minds so that they lost themselves and died in the Great Forest. Dwarves have always been at odds with them, especially the flint dwarves of Verkalskomdir. They famously used special runic warding magic to keep the mind-altering magics of the Fae from leaking into their hold. With the flint hold secured, the ice smiths came up with a different solution. They would turn the routes connecting the mountains to the deep woods into desolate, unusable frozen lands, worse than anything in the giant's anvil. Travel to these glades would be exceedingly difficult due to the constant snows and bitter colds, which lasted for generations after the spells had been cast, and the mountain dwarves would never have to worry about the Fae again. Deeper into the east, Arg-Erdstun had been considered the heart of the Serpent's Reach Mountains, and often had the Reach rallied behind it in opposition to Amdir. While they may have been heated contestants to the power in the Cronium throne long ago, the Diamond Dwarves were nothing compared to the new masters of the region, the Quartz Empire. They resisted as much as they could, but were buried by the ruthless avalanche from the north, and their diamond-cutting skills were put to use in the production of ice gems. Gorburad Hold was built inside a great volcano. The basalt dwarves were well known for using magma and the heat of the volcano in the Gelebur Krakdhum, the fire glass forge. These forges produced obsidian and glass at a staggering rate in ancient times. Their environment was diametrically opposite of what the quartz dwarves lived in, with magma lakes and sweltering temperatures. The ice smiths have had a thought to integrate magma in their ice smithing, theorizing that they could use it to improve their ice steel. The first few attempts to harness the volcano resulted in absolute chaos and catastrophe. The ice magic rejected the magma, resulting in massive explosions of ice shards and fire. Sometimes the spells simply failed, melting everything to sludge. With the hold of Gorburad more blackened and dilapidated than before, some progress was made. Soon, some production of ice steel resulted in batches even stronger than the mithril alloys used in Mithradum, yet production was still very low, not meeting the standards of the Icecraft Hall. Delivering the new steel to the manufactories at Krakdhumvror would take very long and prove to hamper the processes even further. But, a year later, on a clear night in one of the upper observatories of Durvajatun, two ice smiths were enjoying a night of stargazing and drinking when one spotted a comet falling to Halan. He realized by the color of the tail and speed of its descent that it must be Daimstir, and they marveled briefly over how little size reduction it underwent when hurtling through the atmosphere. So many other comets and such are usually seen to burn up very quickly, with very little remaining on impact. An hour or so, and a few bottles later, the ice smith jumped out of his chair. "We'll encase it in Daimstir!" he cried, and grabbing his papers and drink, he ran out of the observatory. His plan now refined through sobriety in this. Daimstir is incredibly heat resistant. Initial tests with small amounts showed that even when engulfed in magma it did not melt, though it would heat up to match the magma's temperatures on the outside. If they were to create a great sphere of ice steel and then encase it in a layer of Daimstir, they believed that they could dip it down into the heart of the magma lake and let it absorb the heat energy contained therein into the ice steel. They would then use this heat to temper the ice steel made in Krakdhumvror and to power the furnaces there for decades to come. The state searched far and wide through the empire and gathered as much Daimstir as they could find. Eventually the casing had been constructed and moved to Krakdhumvror Hold to evolve the ice steel forges to their final form. Krakdhumvror started from humble origins as a remote outpost made to fight ice giants and a place where the unwanted were sent to be forgotten. Now their land stretched from the northern hold to the far southwestern Org-Helovar and everything in between. With a lion's share of the ancient empire under their firm control, they have become smaller yet far better version of what Aldwarov once was. Their ice smithing had become more powerful than their ancestors could have dreamed, and their goods were sought after by all of the world's most wealthiest and most successful. Truly, it was the Quartz dwarves, not the Cronium, who were meant to lead dwarfkind into the future. All they needed was a crown for the High King to show their majesty, and only the finest materials could be used in its construction. The Crown of Everfrost was an artifact made from ice steel forged in Mithradoom's mithril steel alloy furnaces, and it gleamed with a bright shining silver shine, so characteristic of mithril. Mountain patterns were embossed around the band in obsidian from the Gelebur Krakdhum in Gorburad, fused on during the forging of the band itself. On top of each mountain peak sat a different stone, each a representation of the holds which sat within the Empire's borders. At the front, a taller mountain stood with a blizzard motif surrounding it and a large ice gem at its peak glowing softly. This crown was a masterwork of craftsmanship. While pieces of the ancient crown of Aldwarov were still collected and put together, it would remain as a simple historical artifact. The crown of Everfrost would instead forever sit atop the heads of the Quartz dwarves who led the nation further and further down the road to greatness. And there it is, Krakdhumvror, the frozen dwarven gem of the north. One thing to note about them is that they have some of the best dwarven ideas for conquest at this time, and that translates quite well in the campaign. Let's talk briefly about these ideas. Their military angle is quite strong. They begin with 5% discipline in their traditions and are augmented by 15% less shock damage received, 15% extra fort defense, and minus 0.02 monthly war exhaustion. Conquest is supported by a 15% discount to core creation cost, minus 10% province war score cost, and a minus 1 unrest bonus. Their economy gets a small 10% national tax boost, but they save quite a lot of power points with an early 2.5% cheaper technology cost and 10% cheaper development. 10% faster reform progress growth arguably helps with government capacity, which is the major roadblock for expansion in their case. Finally, the +2 available advisors in the pool is not brilliant, but always welcome when trying to focus the advisors towards the immediate necessities of the Empire. I sometimes come back and replay them from time to time, even if other dwarven holds can be more compelling. Their mission tree is very fun, even if it does not do anything particularly wacky. It's very friendly for someone who wants a standard dwarven experience, but Krakdhumvror's start does not accommodate newcomers to the mod. The moment they hit the surface is extremely risky. With no ally support, they are at the mercy of Grombar or the Centaurs, and if the dwarves are too slow to expand, they will most likely be devoured by one of the monstrous empires. Their unique disaster stands at about a 5 on the Heho scale. It is mostly a waiting and reaction game with minimal choices. Not as dangerous as the Horde Curse, but quite taxing on the manpower, it's a good framing for the evolving Quartz culture, even if it is not very exciting mechanically. One thing I really dislike is their Ice Mage estate. Their flavor is not really supported mechanically in a useful way. It's not exciting or interesting to use their set of spells, and one might be tempted to form Aldwarov and ditch the Ice Smiths entirely as soon as possible. Even so, some deviation to the standard is always welcome, and if this is to be the weakness of the Quartz dwarves, then so be it. Not everyone in the dwarven world has to be a competitive speed builder. For that we have Silverforge, Hammerholm, and Shaz-Tundir. Another observation that I have is that typically nations that collect many absolutism bonuses tend to be more evil in nature, and Krakdhumvror does have a few bonuses from their unique governments and their final mission. I wouldn't necessarily classify them as evil, but their Book of Grudges does contain other dwarves alongside the monsters who roam the frozen north. Their propensity for conquest in general puts them at odds with any of their unfortunate neighbors who might see them as cold, merciless killers. And that perception is understandable. Cold is their element after all. I don't remember ever being as expansive as a dwarven hold before. By the end of the game, Escan, the Deep Woods, Dostanor, and half of Hales was colored with the cold teal of the Quartz dwarves. Far from a world conquest, it was the most brutal expansion that I have ever attempted, and I didn't have to try too hard. It feels to me that Krakdhumvror is a very popular tag within the community, and I'm curious why. I would ask if anyone listening this far who has the Frost Dwarfs close to their heart could leave a comment describing the reasons why. I'm not asking this for random engagement, I'm truly curious to hear other people's opinions on why they love the Quartz Dwarfs and what experiences did they have with them that are worth remembering. Thank you once again, dear listeners, and special thanks to the Patreons and members. So thank you Baconomics, Deppert, Casimiro Varel, Loop Forex, Darth Mozart, Maybe Pigeon, Peter Mushinsky, Alex, Generalissimo, Jacob Rubin, Michael VR, Old Toby, Shredded Paper Plate, and Thorsmane. Bye everybody, and don't forget to keep your room temperature at 19 degrees Celsius for an ideal sleeping temperature. Cheers!